"Go ahead, Ethan, show her what she is," Victoria said, her voice light, almost amused, as if this were nothing more than a passing moment of entertainment. And the room followed her tone, soft laughter folding into the hum of the Carter estate's perfect, climate-controlled silence, while Ava Johnson stood in the center of it all, still as glass. The faint buzz of the electric clippers vibrating through the air like a low current that never quite touched her. Not really, not where it mattered, because her eyes weren't on the boy holding the device, and they weren't on the polished marble floor beneath her feet either. They were fixed somewhere deeper, somewhere past the reflection of crystal chandeliers and billion-dollar confidence, somewhere behind the image of a family that had never once been told no. Ethan Carter smirked as he circled her, the cordless clipper resting loosely in his hand like a toy he'd already grown bored of, his designer sneakers barely making a sound against the stone as he tilted his head, studying her reaction with the lazy curiosity of someone who had never had to earn respect and didn't recognize it when it stood right in front of him. "You're not going to say anything?" he asked, almost disappointed, while Richard Carter remained seated on the edge of a leather armchair, one leg crossed over the other, scrolling through something on his phone with the detached ease of a man whose time was always more valuable than the people around him. And yet, he didn't stop it, didn't look up, didn't need to, because control for him had never required effort. It simply existed, built into the walls, into the contracts, into the lives of people like Ava who moved quietly through his world, invisible until moments like this forced them into focus. Ava's uniform was simple, pressed, immaculate. The kind of quiet professionalism that kept households like this running without acknowledgement. Her hands rested loosely at her sides, not clenched, not trembling, just still. And that stillness unsettled something subtle in the air, something no one in the room had the language to name. The clippers hummed again as Ethan stepped closer, lifting them just enough for the sound to sharpen, for the moment to stretch, for the expectation of reaction to build. But Ava didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't give them what they were waiting for. And that was the first crack, though none of them recognized it yet. Victoria let out a soft laugh, brushing a strand of her perfectly styled hair behind her ear. "Honestly, I thought she'd at least try to argue," she said, glancing briefly toward her husband, who didn't respond, his silence not disapproval, not approval either, just indifference, the kind that had built empires and erased consequences. But Ava heard every word, felt the weight of it settle into the quiet space between breaths, and for a moment the world narrowed, not in fear, not in humiliation, but in clarity, the kind that arrives when illusion dissolves completely, when people reveal themselves without disguise, when the roles are no longer assumptions but facts. Ethan lowered the clippers slightly, studying her again, something flickering behind his casual arrogance. Not guilt, not yet, just confusion at the absence of resistance. "You're weird," he muttered, almost under his breath, as if that explained it, as if that justified everything. Ava's reflection caught briefly in the floor-to-ceiling window behind them, the city stretching out beyond like a promise built on invisible labor, on decisions made in rooms like this, on silence mistaken for weakness. And in that reflection, she didn't see a victim. She saw a pattern, a system, a flaw waiting to be exposed. Her lips parted slightly, not to plead, not to protest, but to breathe, steady and controlled. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost gentle, yet it carried in a way none of their laughter ever could. "It's okay," she said, meeting Ethan's gaze for the first time, her eyes clear, unshaken. "I see everything I need to see." Ava did not move right away after she spoke, not because she was waiting for permission, but because she had learned long ago that stillness could say more than reaction ever could. And in that quiet second, something subtle shifted in the room, not enough for them to notice, not enough for it to matter yet, but enough to exist, enough to mark the beginning of something none of them could see. She turned her gaze slightly toward the floor, watching the faint reflection of the chandelier ripple across the polished marble. The light fractured into pieces that never quite settled, and it reminded her of nights spent studying under flickering bulbs in a one-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago, where the hum of old wiring was louder than the silence people assumed poverty carried, where her mother would sit at the kitchen table with stacks of medical bills spread out like puzzles that never solved themselves, and Ava, younger then, would trace numbers with her finger, learning patterns before she understood what they meant, learning systems before she ever stepped inside one. She had not always worn a uniform like this, had not always moved quietly through spaces designed to overlook her. There had been a time when her name was printed on office doors, when her credentials opened rooms instead of closing them, data compliance analyst. That was the title, a position that required precision, patience, and a willingness to see what others preferred to ignore. She had been good at it, not because she chased success, but because she understood something deeper, that truth had structure, that systems always left traces, that even billion-dollar companies could not hide everything if someone knew where to look, and she had looked late nights in front of dual monitors, coffee going cold beside her keyboard as she cross-referenced transactions, flagged anomalies, built quiet reports that no one asked for, but everyone eventually feared. Carter Tech had not been different at first, just another client, another set of data streams flowing through secure servers. But patterns had emerged, subtle at first, then undeniable discrepancies. Buried in layers of complexity, transactions routed through shells that existed just long enough to disappear, compliance reports signed off too quickly, too clean, like someone had polished the surface without checking what lay beneath. Ava had written the report, thorough, precise, undeniable. She had submitted it through the proper channels, had followed every rule they trained her to follow. And for a brief moment, she believed the system would respond the way it was designed to, but systems built by people often serve people, not truth. The meeting had been short. Her supervisor had not met her eyes. Human resources had used words like restructuring, like misalignment, like opportunity elsewhere. And just like that, her access was gone. Her name removed, her work absorbed into silence. She remembered packing her things into a single cardboard box, the office lights too bright, the air too cold. The realization settling in not as anger, but as clarity. They had not fired her because she was wrong. They had removed her because she was right in a way that threatened something larger than policy. And from that day forward, Ava Johnson understood the difference between being excluded and being positioned. She had taken the job at the Carter estate months later, not out of desperation, though she needed the income, not out of resignation, though it looked that way from the outside, but out of proximity, because systems were easier to understand from the inside, because patterns revealed themselves faster when you were close enough to observe without being seen. She learned their routines, their schedules, the rhythm of meetings and calls that echoed through open spaces, the names that appeared in passing conversations, the fragments of information most people dismissed as background noise, and she collected them, not on paper, not in anything that could be traced, but in memory, structured, organized, waiting, and now, standing in the center of that same house, under the same lights that had witnessed their laughter, she understood that this moment, this display of arrogance and carelessness, was not an interruption. It was confirmation. Her hand lifted slightly, not to touch her head, not to react, but to adjust the cuff of her sleeve, a small, precise motion, controlled, deliberate. And when she stepped back, turning toward the hallway that led away from the main living area, her posture remained unchanged, steady, composed, as if nothing had happened at all, as if this had always been part of the plan. The hallway swallowed the sound of the living room behind her as Ava stepped forward, her shoes soft against the runner rug that stretched the length of the Carter estate like a quiet boundary between two worlds, and with each step the air shifted, cooler, dimmer, stripped of the artificial brightness that filled the main rooms where power liked to display itself. Here the walls were lined with framed achievements, magazine covers, photographs of Richard Carter shaking hands with politicians and executives, moments captured as proof of dominance, of control, of permanence. And Ava let her eyes move across them, without slowing, not impressed, not intimidated, just observing the way she always had, cataloging without emotion, because she understood something they did not. That permanence was often just a well-maintained illusion. Her reflection flickered briefly in the glass of one of the frames. her posture straight, her expression calm, her presence almost ghost-like in a space that had never been designed to see her. And yet she had been here long enough to know every corner, every blind spot, every pattern that repeated itself beneath the surface of routine. She reached the service corridor and pushed the door open gently, the hinge releasing a faint sound that disappeared as quickly as it came. Inside, the lighting was fluorescent, practical, unflattering, the kind that revealed everything without trying to make it beautiful. And for a moment she paused, not out of hesitation, but out of alignment, as if she were stepping from one layer of reality into another that felt more honest. The stainless steel surfaces reflected a version of her that was sharper, less softened by distance. And she met that reflection without looking away. Her hand moved again, this time resting briefly against the side of her head. Not tracing, not lingering, just acknowledging the physical sensation of what had been done. The cool air against skin that had been hidden before, a contrast that might have unsettled someone else. But for Ava, it registered simply as data, another detail, another variable in a system she already understood. Her phone rested in the pocket of her uniform, silent, unremarkable, indistinguishable from any other device carried by staff moving through the house. But it was not ordinary, not in function, not in purpose. It had been with her from the beginning. Configured carefully, secured beyond standard protocols, its storage not cluttered with personal messages or distractions, but structured, intentional, holding fragments that alone meant nothing, but together formed something undeniable. She pulled it out now, her thumb moving across the screen with practiced precision, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate. A list appeared, timestamps, encrypted files, notes that only she could interpret fully, conversations recorded, not in violation, but in awareness, patterns mapped quietly over months of proximity, the kind of proximity that people like the Carters never questioned because they did not believe anyone in her position could see what mattered, and that had always been their mistake, not underestimating intelligence, but underestimating attention. She scrolled once, twice, stopping briefly on a file marked with a date from 48 hours earlier, her gaze steady, her breathing even, the memory of that moment clear. A conversation. In the study, voices low but careless, numbers mentioned in passing that did not align with public reports, decisions framed as strategy that crossed lines most people never noticed until it was too late. She had not reacted then either, had simply continued her work, moving through the room as if she were invisible, because in a way she was invisible enough to hear everything, to understand everything, to connect what others left disconnected. Her thumb hovered for a fraction of a second, not in doubt, but in confirmation. Then the screen dimmed as she locked the device again, sliding it back in her pocket with the same calm she carried in every movement. Down the hall, a clock ticked steadily, marking time in a house that believed it controlled it. But Ava knew better. Time did not belong to them. Not anymore. And as she continued toward the exit that led to the back of the estate, the weight of what was coming did not press on her, did not slow her, because it had already been set in motion long before tonight, long before laughter echoed across marble floors, long before anyone thought to look at her and see less than what she was. And that was the quiet truth they had missed, not that she would respond, but that she already had. The back door opened with a soft mechanical click, and a breath of night air slipped inside, cool and clean, carrying the faint scent of wet grass and distant asphalt, still holding the heat from the day. And Ava stepped out without looking back, not because she was avoiding what had just happened, but because there was nothing behind her worth returning to. The gravel path curved along the side of the estate, lined with low garden lights that cast narrow pools of gold onto the ground. Each step measured, each movement steady, her silhouette stretching and folding with the rhythm of those lights, as if the night itself were tracking her exit. The city skyline stood miles away, but visible, sharp edges of glass towers catching the last traces of fading light. A reminder of where power truly lived, not in houses like this, but in the systems that connected them. And Ava had spent years learning those systems, understanding the way influence moved through data, through contracts, through Decisions made in rooms she was never meant to enter. Her hand slipped in her pocket again, not searching, not uncertain, just confirming the device was still there, still silent, still holding everything it needed to hold. She reached the gate and paused, fingers brushing against the cold metal latch. The estate behind her quiet now, laughter replaced by distance, by the kind of silence that comes when people believe a moment has ended. But for Ava, this was not an ending. It was alignment, the point where intention and action finally met without resistance. She stepped through the gate and let it close behind her with a soft, final sound that did not echo. The street beyond was empty, wide, bordered by trimmed hedges and identical driveways that led to houses built to resemble security. But she knew better than to confuse appearance with reality. She walked toward the curb where a single streetlight flickered faintly, its glow uneven, revealing the texture of the pavement beneath her feet. Small cracks, subtle imperfections, the kind most people never noticed, the kind that told a different story if you knew how to read them. Her reflection appeared briefly in the dark window of a parked car, sharper now, stripped of the context that had defined her inside the house. No uniform authority watching her, no expectations pressing in, just herself, exactly as she was. And for the first time that night, her expression shifted, not into anger, not into sadness, but into something quieter, something resolved. Her phone vibrated once. A single, controlled signal that broke the stillness without disrupting it. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. No name, no number, just a notification, encrypted, simple, the kind that would mean nothing to anyone else, but to her it was confirmation. The files had been received, processed, acknowledged. Her thumb hovered for a moment before tapping once, a small action, almost insignificant, but it completed something that had been building for months, maybe longer. She lowered the phone again, slipping it back in her pocket as if nothing had changed, but everything had, because somewhere far from this quiet street, systems had already begun to move, servers had already logged entries that could not be erased, processes had already been triggered that no amount of influence could fully contain, and Ava knew the timing of it. Knew that by morning the first signs would appear, subtle at first, questions. Where there had been certainty, hesitation where there had been control. She took a slow breath, the cool air filling her lungs, grounding her in the present moment, even as the future unfolded exactly as it was meant to. A car passed at the end of the street, headlights sweeping briefly across her figure before disappearing, leaving her once again in that quiet, steady glow. And she continued walking, not hurried, not hesitant, just forward, because everything that needed to be done had already been set into motion long before anyone thought to look at her and see someone they could dismiss. And that was the difference they would not understand until it was far too late, that while they were watching the moment, she had been shaping the outcome. Morning did not arrive all at once. It unfolded in layers, the pale blue light slipping between the glass towers of downtown Chicago, reflecting off mirrored surfaces that had always symbolized clarity and control. And inside the upper floors of Carter Tech headquarters, the day began the way it always did, quiet, precise, predictable. Assistants moved through corridors with tablets in hand. Elevators opened and closed with soft chimes, and on the 32nd floor, Richard Carter stepped out of his private lift, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit as if the world itself aligned with his schedule. His phone already pressed to his ear, voice low, confident, issuing directives that rarely needed to be questioned. But today there was something different, something subtle, not visible, not yet, but present, like a frequency just beyond hearing. The receptionist glanced up as he passed, her greeting a fraction slower than usual, her smile not quite as certain. And further down the hall, a pair of analysts stood too close together, their conversation cutting off abruptly as he approached, not out of respect, but hesitation, a hesitation that did not belong in a place like this. Richard noticed it, not consciously, not in a way that demanded attention, but enough for a slight crease to form between his brows before smoothing out again, because control had always meant ignoring what did not fit. His office door closed behind him with a muted click, sealing him inside a space designed for authority. Floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a possession, screens lining one wall, displaying market data in real time. Numbers shifting, rising, falling, the constant pulse of a system he believed he understood completely. He set his phone down on the desk and glanced at the near screen, and for a moment, everything looked normal, familiar patterns, expected movement. But then one line caught his attention, not because it was dramatic, but because it was wrong in a way that did not make immediate sense. A minor fluctuation in one of the company's less visible divisions. A dip so small most would ignore it. But Richard did not build an empire by ignoring details. His hand moved to the keyboard, pulling up additional data, drilling down into the source, his movements precise, controlled, the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. But the deeper he looked, the less it aligned. Another discrepancy appeared, then another, small, isolated, easy to dismiss on their own. But together they formed a pattern that did not belong. His jaw tightened slightly, the first real shift in his composure. He reached for his phone again, dialing without hesitation. "Get me compliance," he said, his voice steady but sharper now. And across the floor that same unease continued to spread. Systems that had always responded instantly began to lag by seconds. Files that should have opened immediately hesitated. Internal messages flagged themselves for review without clear cause, and in the lower levels of the building, servers processed incoming requests at a volume that did not match. The visible traffic, logs updating in rapid succession, entries stacking in ways that could not be reversed, and no one in the building understood why. Not yet, because what they were seeing was only the surface, the first visible ripple of something much larger already in motion. Richard stood now, moving toward the window, as if distance might provide clarity, the city below continuing as if nothing had changed, cars moving, people walking, life unaffected by the subtle fracture forming high. Above them, his reflection stared back at him in the glass, composed, controlled, but behind that reflection something else was beginning to take shape, not fear, not yet, but recognition, the kind that arrives when control slips just enough to reveal that it was never absolute. And somewhere miles away, far from the polished floors and controlled environments, Ava Johnson walked past a small neighborhood coffee shop, the bell above the door chiming softly. As she stepped inside, the warmth of the space wrapping around her, the smell of fresh coffee grounding, ordinary, real, she moved to the counter, her posture the same, steady, unhurried, as if the world had not shifted overnight, as if nothing had changed at all. And when she placed her order, her voice calm and clear, there was no trace of what she had set in motion, no sign of the systems already responding to her quiet decisions. Only the simple presence of someone who understood exactly where she stood and exactly what came next. The coffee shop hummed with a quiet kind of life that did not demand attention. Soft conversations blending with the low hiss of the espresso machine, ceramic cups touching saucers with a muted rhythm that felt almost deliberate, and Ava stood near the pickup counter, her fingers loosely wrapped around the warm paper cup they had just handed her, the heat grounding, steady, real in a way nothing inside the Carter estate had ever been. Sunlight filtered through the front windows, catching the edges of her silhouette, illuminating the smooth curve of her head without shadow, without concealment. And for a brief moment she closed her eyes, not to escape, not to hide, but to settle into the stillness she had carried with her through every step of the last 12 hours. The world outside continued as it always did, cars passing, people crossing the street, unaware of the quiet fracture spreading through a system they relied on but never questioned. Her phone remained silent in her pocket now, no new notifications, no urgency, because the process no longer required her input. It had moved beyond that point. She took a slow sip of her coffee, the bitterness sharp, clean, and set the cup down on the small table beside her, her reflection faintly visible in the dark surface of the window, not distorted, not hidden, simply present. And for the first time that morning there was a shift in her breathing. Not tension, not release, but something in between, a recognition of distance, of how far she had come from the version of herself that once believed systems corrected themselves, that truth alone was enough to trigger change. She knew better now. Truth needed timing, structure, placement. It needed to be seen in the right way at the right moment. and she had learned how to build that moment piece by piece, across months of observation and restraint, across nights where silence felt heavier than action, across decisions that required patience instead of reaction. The barista called out another name behind her, the sound blending into the background as Ava reached for her cup again, lifting it slowly, her gaze drifting back to the street. A group of office workers hurried past, their expressions focused, unaware that somewhere above them, in buildings that defined their routines, something had begun to unravel. Not dramatically, not yet, but in ways that would become impossible to ignore. She imagined the screens in Carter Tech's headquarters, the numbers shifting, the small inconsistencies stacking into questions no one could answer cleanly. She imagined Richard standing at the window, searching for clarity in a reflection that would not provide it. And for a brief moment, there was no satisfaction in that image, no sense of victory, only a quiet acknowledgement that actions carried weight whether they were seen or not, that consequences did not need emotion to exist. They only needed truth. Her fingers traced lightly along the edge of the cup. The cardboard sleeve, slightly worn, textured, ordinary. Everything about this moment grounded her in something simple, something real. And it stood in stark contrast to the controlled perfection of the world she had just left behind. She stepped away from the table and moved toward the door, pushing it open with a gentle motion, the bell chiming again as she stepped back into the daylight, the air warmer now, the city fully awake. And as she walked down the sidewalk, her pace unhurried, her posture unchanged, there was a calm certainty in every step, not because she was waiting for what would happen next, but because she understood that it was already happening, that somewhere in the network of decisions and data she had set in motion, the truth was moving, connecting, revealing itself in ways no one could stop, and she did not need to watch it unfold to know exactly where it would lead. By mid-morning, the illusion of control had begun to fracture in ways that could no longer be dismissed as minor inconsistencies. And inside the Carter Tech headquarters, the atmosphere had shifted from quiet confidence to something tighter, more fragile, as if the air itself had grown heavier with questions no one was prepared to answer. Richard stood at the center of his office now, no longer seated, no longer composed in the effortless way he had carried for years. Multiple screens lit up in front of him, each one telling a version of the same story, but from different angles. Discrepancies in financial routing, compliance flags triggered across divisions that had never once failed an internal audit, legal alerts surfacing from regulatory bodies that did not move without cause. And for the first time in a very long time, the pattern did not belong to him. It did not originate from a competitor. It did not follow any strategy he recognized. It felt external and internal at the same time, like something that had been planted quietly and allowed to grow until it could no longer be contained. His phone buzzed continuously on the desk, messages stacking faster than he could respond, names he trusted requesting immediate clarification, board members asking for emergency calls, and beneath all of it, a single line in one report held his attention longer than the rest, a timestamp from 2 days prior, a submission routed through a secure compliance channel that had bypassed internal suppression layers entirely. His eyes narrowed slightly as he expanded the file, scrolling through lines of data that felt disturbingly precise, too clean, too organized, every inconsistency mapped, every transaction connected, every weak point exposed, not as speculation, but as structure. And as he read further, something deeper settled in, not panic, not yet, but recognition, because whoever had built this did not stumble onto the truth. They had constructed it deliberately, patiently, from the inside out. The realization did not arrive all at once. It formed slowly, piece by piece, like a reflection coming into focus. The memory of small moments resurfacing, conversations that had seemed insignificant, routines that had felt too consistent, presence that had been too quiet to notice, and suddenly, absence made sense in a way presence never had. He exhaled slowly, the first break in his controlled rhythm, and turned toward the window again. But this time the city did not look like something he owned. It looked distant, detached, moving without him. While across town, Ava stepped onto a quieter street lined with brick buildings and narrow sidewalks, her pace steady. The sound of her footsteps blending into the rhythm of the city without drawing attention. Her phone remained silent, no new signals, no need for confirmation, because she already knew where the process stood. She had seen the timeline before it began, had measured the delay between exposure and reaction, had accounted for the time it would take for systems to recognize what they could no longer ignore. She paused briefly at a crosswalk, the light above shifting from red to green, the soft electronic signal marking the change. And for a moment she stood still, watching the flow of people move around her, each one carrying their own direction, their own purpose, unaware of the larger shift unfolding just beyond their awareness. Her reflection appeared again in a storefront window, clear, unhidden, and she met it with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. Not pride, not satisfaction, just understanding, because this had never been about revenge. It had never been about reaction. It had always been about alignment, about placing truth where it could not be ignored, about allowing systems to respond to what they were designed to respond to when given the right conditions. She stepped forward as the crowd moved, blending seamlessly into the motion, her presence unremarkable to everyone around her, and yet somewhere far behind her, in rooms filled with glass and steel and authority, everything was beginning to collapse under the weight of what she had quietly set in motion long before anyone thought to look at her and see less than what she was. The call came just after noon, not through official channels, not through assistants or scheduled lines, but directly, a number Ava recognized without needing to check twice. And for a moment she let it ring, not out of hesitation, not out of uncertainty, but because timing mattered. Even now, especially now, she stood near the edge of a quiet park a few blocks from the business district, the city noise softened by distance, leaves shifting gently overhead as a light breeze moved through the branches. And when she finally answered, her voice was calm, even unchanged. "Hello," she said. And on the other end there was a pause, a fraction too long to be casual, the kind of silence that revealed more than words ever could. Richard Carter did not speak immediately, and when he did, his voice was different, still controlled, still measured, but stripped of the effortless certainty it once carried. "We need to talk," he said, not as a command, not as an assumption, but as a request that he was not used to making. Ava's gaze drifted across the park, people walking, sitting, living moments untouched by what had unfolded in the last few hours. "You already have everything you need," she replied quietly. And again there was silence, heavier this time, as if the weight of that statement had settled somewhere deeper than either of them expected. "You think this is a misunderstanding," Richard continued, choosing his words carefully now. "But there are consequences to what you have done." The phrasing was deliberate, an attempt to reclaim structure, to frame the situation within something familiar, something he could control. But Ava did not interrupt, did not challenge. She simply listened, and when he finished, her response came without hesitation. "No," she said softly. "There are consequences to what you did." The distinction was simple, but shifted everything, because it removed her from the center of the problem and placed it exactly where it belonged, on actions that had existed long before she ever stepped into his house, on decisions made under the assumption that no one was watching closely enough to understand them. Richard exhaled slowly on the other end, the sound subtle but real. "What do you want?" he asked, and this time there was no attempt to disguise the question as anything else. No framing, no positioning, just a direct admission that he no longer knew the answer. Ava's eyes moved to the ground for a moment, watching a single leaf drift down and settle against the pavement. Light, unforced, inevitable. "I do not want anything," she said, her voice steady. "I already made my choice." And that was the truth he was not prepared for, because it removed negotiation entirely. It removed leverage. It removed the structure he relied on to solve every problem he had ever faced. There was nothing to offer, nothing to exchange, nothing to fix in the way he understood fixing. "You could have come to me," he said after a moment, the words quieter now, less certain. "You could have said something." Ava closed her eyes briefly, not in frustration, not in anger, but in recognition of how deeply that perspective was rooted. "I did," she answered. You just did not hear me. And for a long second, neither of them spoke. The city continued around her, unchanged, steady, while on the other end of the line, everything had already begun to unravel beyond repair. This will destroy everything, Richard said finally, the first trace of something unguarded breaking through his voice, and Ava's expression did not change. Her posture remained calm, grounded, as she responded with the same quiet clarity she had carried from the beginning. No, she said, it reveals everything. And then she lowered the phone, ending the call, not abruptly, not dramatically, but simply as if the conversation had reached its natural conclusion, as if there was nothing more to be said. She stood there for a moment longer, the breeze moving gently through the trees above, the light shifting slightly as clouds passed overhead. And then she turned and continued walking, her steps steady, her direction clear, leaving behind not a moment of revenge, but the quiet aftermath of truth finally being seen for what it had always been. The afternoon light stretched longer across the city as Ava continued walking, the rhythm of her steps steady against the pavement, each footfall soft but certain, as if she were moving in sync with something deeper than the world around her. And behind her, far beyond the quiet streets and ordinary faces, the Carter name was no longer spoken with the same weight it had carried that morning. Screens that once displayed growth now flickered with uncertainty. Headlines began to form in digital spaces where information moved faster than reputation could follow, and inside the glass towers that had once symbolized control, voices overlapped in urgent tones, decisions made too quickly, responses issued too late. But Ava did not turn back, did not check her phone, did not search for confirmation, because she did not need to witness the collapse to understand it. She had already seen the structure that held it together, and she had already placed truth where it could not be ignored. She reached a quieter block where the noise of the city softened into something more human, the distant sound of a bus braking, the murmur of conversation from a nearby cafe, the subtle hum of life continuing without interruption. And for a moment she slowed, not out of hesitation, but to take in the stillness that had been missing from every space she had occupied before this. The kind of stillness that did not depend on control, that did not require perfection, just presence. Her reflection appeared once more in the window of a small bookstore, clear and unfiltered, the smooth curve of her head catching the late sunlight without shadow, without disguise, and she paused there briefly, meeting her own gaze with a quiet acknowledgement, not of what had been taken, but of what had never been lost, her dignity, her clarity, her ability to see beyond what others accepted. Without question, she lifted her hand slightly, not to cover, not to adjust, just to feel the air move across her skin, a simple sensation that grounded her in the moment, real, undeniable. And then she let her hand fall back to her side, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. The door of the bookstore opened beside her with a soft chime, someone stepping out, nodding politely as they passed, unaware of the weight of the moment they had just crossed, unaware of the quiet conclusion. Unfolding in a world that rarely paused to notice such things, Ava stepped forward again, leaving the reflection behind, not because she was turning away from it, but because she no longer needed it to define where she stood. The path ahead was not marked by victory, not shaped by revenge, but by something steadier, something built on the understanding that truth did not need to be loud to be powerful. It only needed to be placed where it mattered. And as the light shifted across the street, casting long shadows that stretched toward the horizon, she moved with it, unhurried, unburdened, her presence blending into the rhythm of the city, while far behind her, in rooms filled with glass and steel and fading certainty, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recognition, full of consequences, full of the quiet realization that what they had dismissed had never been weakness, only patience. And that patience had changed everything without ever needing to raise its voice.